Several months ago, we highlighted 10 standout tracks from 60s France that captured a grittier and more aggressive sound with clear echoes of garage rock, freakbeat, and proto-punk. These were tracks driven by fuzzed-out guitars, feedback, and a defiant edge that still makes them sound remarkably vital today. The 60s French music scene is often defined by the rise of the yeah movement, a youth-led pop wave built on catchy melodies, modern style, and a playful sense of rebellion. But beneath its surface, a louder and more restless sound was emerging. And once again, this video presents 10 more tracks from 60s France that explore that same world, whether rooted in garage rock, psychedelia, or the wilder fringes of French pop music. Each track carries a sense of experimentation and distinctive sonic edge. So without further ado, let's begin. The previous video mentioned this song in passing, but this track is so good that it deserved its own feature. Pas Question captured the sharper guitar-driven edge that was beginning to emerge within French pop music in the 60s, and features one of the greatest fuzz guitar sounds of 1966, not just in France but anywhere. While many French singers in the mid-60s were still adapting Anglo-American hits, Chardin was already writing more original material inspired by contemporary sounds. And his punchy vocal delivery, combined with the fuzz guitar and urgent rhythm, gives this track an almost proto-punk energy, and makes it a great example of what is now known as freakbeat. But this wasn't his only fuzz-driven track from the period. Another standout was Je te veux, which carried a similarly sharp and electrified energy. Chardin also wrote songs for other artists such as Stone, and one of the highlights of their collaboration was C'est ma vie, which was featured in the previous video. All of these tracks were originally released as EPs and have since become cult favorites, turning many of these records into incredibly expensive collector's items. But fortunately, all these tracks and EPs mentioned have been reissued by Pop Supérette, an excellent French label that specializes in bringing some of these fuzz-driven gems from the 60s back into circulation. I'll leave a link to the label in the description so you can check out some of their releases for yourselves. And speaking of fuzz guitars, Karina is mostly known as an actress and an icon of the Nouvelle Vague, the French New Wave movement that revolutionized cinema in the 60s. Karina starred in some of the most important films by Jean-Luc Godard and became a very popular actress, but she also tried her hand at music, and she released this superb tune called Roller Girl in 1967. The track featured a fantastic primal sound driven by gritty guitar work, stomping drums, and an effortlessly cool and detached vocal performance from Karina. And I just can never get enough of that filthy fuzz guitar. Roller Girl was written and composed by Serge Gainsbourg for a TV musical film called Anna, directed by Pierre Koralnik and starring Karina herself, and it also appears on the film's soundtrack. It's a perfect example of how cinema and pop music often overlapped in 60s France, and the song is a brief but memorable detour that reveals another side of Karina's artistic world.
Je me suis acheté une machine à l'hydroflex Simus. Elle prévoit tout ce qu'on devine, y a un cerveau à rébus.
La Machine by Dani is one of the most peculiar and infectious French recordings of the late 60s. The song was released in 1967, and it stood out for its quirky atmosphere, repetitive structure, and irresistible sense of momentum, giving it a uniquely strange and distinctive character.
Il y a des boutons partout, les boutons, moi ça me rend dingue. Je les appuie tous d'un coup, ça fait plus de bruit qu'un flingue.
Dani cultivated a cool and stylish image that made her one of the most distinctive figures of the French pop scene during the decade. And even though the song still carried elements of yeah pop, it leaned towards its more unruly and eccentric corners, driven by pounding drums, sharp guitar work, and a strangely hypnotic vibe. And this wasn't the only memorable track that she released during that period. La Fille à la Moto was another track which carried a similarly cool and rebellious energy.
Je suis la fille à la moto, je suis la seule, je suis
Both tracks are perfect examples of how 60s French pop could also become weird, hypnotic, and unexpectedly raw, and they remain two of the most compelling recordings to emerge from its more unconventional sides. But when it comes to sheer raw energy, the following track is one of the wildest recordings to come out of 60s France. Turnover by Les Goths is one of the heaviest and most explosive recordings to emerge from the French underground during the late 60s. The song was built around crushing fuzz guitar, wild phasing effects, and an overwhelming wall of sound, and its sheer intensity is strongly reminiscent of bands like Blue Cheer. The song's raw and chaotic sound has also often been compared to Detroit groups such as the Stooges and the MC5, although Turnover was released a year before the debut albums by both bands. The group was formed in Normandy, and they were very influenced by the heavier side of British and American psychedelia, and Turnover is a rare example of a French recording from this era being sung in English, further underlining its closer alignment with the Anglo-American underground rock sound of the period. The band only released a couple of singles before disappearing by the end of the decade, but those recordings eventually became major cult favorites among collectors, and Turnover remains one of the most ferocious examples of how raw and extreme some French recordings had become by the end of the 60s. But now let's go back to the mod sounds of 1966. Les Boots were one of the best French mod bands of the 60s, and alongside artists such as Ronny and groups like Les Problèmes, they were part of a growing anti-yéyé movement within the French music scene, bands developing a rougher and more guitar-driven approach inspired by the mod sounds coming out of Britain. The group only released 2 EPs, and this track called 20 ans came from their second record, which is generally considered the stronger and more adventurous of the two. By this point, Les Boots were pushing further into the sort of 60s sounds that are now known as freakbeat, music that bridged the mod and beat sounds of the period with a more unconventional and slightly psychedelic approach. And that sound is perfectly exemplified by this other standout track from the EP. Their last release was a 7-inch single that featured another excellent song called Tout va bien. Unfortunately, due to insufficient sales, Polydor eventually dropped the group, and their final EP from 1967 was never released. Nowadays, the second EP by Les Boots is widely regarded as one of the finest freakbeat releases to emerge from 60s France, and it has become an extremely expensive collector's item. But fortunately, just like the previously mentioned material by Stone and Eric Chardin, the record has since been reissued by Pop Supérette, alongside another EP featuring the aforementioned Tout va bien and a few unreleased tracks. Ronny was one of the first French artists to fully embrace the harder-edge sounds coming out of Britain during the mid-60s, particularly groups like the Rolling Stones and the Kinks, and many of his earlier recordings were French adaptations of songs by the Stones and even lesser-known British bands such as the Pretty Things. At the time, Ronny Bird's backing band featured guitarist Mick Jones, who would later achieve worldwide recognition in the 70s as a founding member of Foreigner. Alongside his friend and drummer Tommy Brown, Jones also worked as a backing musician and composer for other French artists such as Johnny Hallyday, and this track called N'écoute pas ton cœur was one of the many songs written by the duo during that period. Ronny Bird's music was deeply tied to the rapid changes taking place within the British music scene, and the song clearly reflected the influence of bands like The Who, and especially the Yardbirds. The track is reminiscent of that fascinating transitional moment when the Yardbirds were beginning to push rock music into more experimental territory, with groundbreaking recordings such as Shapes of Things and Happenings 10 years time ago, tracks that anticipated the psychedelic explosion that would fully emerge in 1967. And even Mick Jones's guitar break is strongly reminiscent of Jeff Beck's playing during that era. But N'écoute pas ton cœur is far more than just an imitation of contemporary British groups. It's a fantastic song in its own right. And just like several other tracks featured in this video, it perfectly captures that unique moment when the mod and rhythm and blues sounds of the mid-60s were becoming increasingly strange, experimental and way out, resulting in one of the 60s most creative periods.
Dans la galaxie, je tourne sans cesse.
Dans la Galaxie by Bruno Leys was released in 1969, and it's one of the strangest and most hypnotic French psychedelic recordings of the late 60s. The song combined hazy vocals and a drifting psychedelic atmosphere that was further enhanced by the use of the onde martenot, an early electronic instrument rarely heard in pop music at the time, giving the track a distinctly otherworldly sound that was completely unlike most French pop recordings from the period. This was the only single Bruno Leys ever released, but Dans la Galaxie gradually developed a major cult reputation over the years, and is now widely regarded as one of the holy grails of late 60s French psychedelia. Its growing reputation eventually led to the track being featured on several compilations devoted to obscure psychedelic singles from the 60s, and it was even reissued by Born Bad Records in 2020. Stella was one of the most unusual figures to emerge from the French pop scene of the 60s. Even though she is often grouped alongside the yeah-yeah singers of the era, her music frequently satirized the movement itself, and she had a more adventurous and guitar-driven sound than most of her female contemporaries. Le Dol des Jeunes was released in 1967, and the song was a playful and ironic satire in which Stella took the piss out of the fascination that some French intellectuals and trend followers had with Maoist ideas during the late 60s, while wrapping those ideas in one of the most fuzz-drenched and psychedelic recordings of her career, even including a nod to Purple Haze by Jimi Hendrix, which had been released just a few months before.
Je suis mort, je suis mort. Un point de ses tongs.
Even though Stella largely disappeared from the pop scene by the end of the decade, the song gradually developed a cult following, and it's now widely regarded as one of the absolute high points of French female-fronted psychedelia from the 60s. Later in the 70s, Stella married Christian Vander, drummer of French progressive rock band Magma, and she went on to appear on numerous Magma albums.
La dame pipi vient te trouver, te demande comment va ta femme. Elle est partie avec ma collection de porte-clés et me laisse tout seul avec un gosse à élever.
Long Chris is best remembered today as a songwriter for Johnny Hallyday, having written numerous songs for the French rock star during the 60s and 70s. But Long Chris was also a recording artist in his own right, and some of his solo work explored far stranger territory than most French pop records of the period. Névralgie particulière was released in 1966, and it remains one of the most startling recordings to emerge from 60s France. The song was built around a raw and aggressive sound, with piercing fuzz guitars and a confrontational vocal performance. And the result is an urgency and intensity that places it among the kind of 60s recordings that are now regarded as proto-punk.
Poursuivi par la garde républicaine, rutilante de quincaillerie.
The song appeared on the album Chansons Bizarres pour gens étranges, which can be translated as Strange Songs for Strange People, a title that perfectly captures the eccentric nature of the material. Rather than telling a conventional story, the song unfolds as a surreal stream of images and situations, very much in the tradition of surrealist poetry and beat literature. 60 years later, Névralgie particulière remains every bit as compelling as it was in 1966, and its raw energy, aggressive delivery, and unconventional spirit continue to set it apart from almost everything else being recorded in France at the time.
C'est les bras que pour réussir, la foi seule ne saurait suffire.
Bye Bye City by Le Coeur is one of the more obscure late 60s French pop recordings to resurface among collectors in later decades. Not much is known about the group, but the song was released in 1969 as part of a single on the Barclay label, and it captures a distinctly late 60s atmosphere where French pop was absorbing influences from psychedelic rock and more experimental production techniques. From the very opening seconds, the song makes an immediate impact with a burst of fuzz guitar that tries to imitate the sound of a ship's siren, a texture that reappears throughout the track and never quite lets go. The song was built on a strong pop framework with fantastic instrumental foundation, and on top of that, it features a delightfully melancholic vocal delivery, which is further enhanced by studio processing and psychedelic effects that give the song a slightly surreal and disorienting edge. While not a widely known release at the time, Bye Bye City has since gained attention through reissues and inclusion on compilations of obscure French beat and pop music from the era, and it is a beautifully melancholic slice of psychedelia, blending pop craftsmanship and studio experimentation. And with this, we arrive at the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed this journey back to 60s France. See you next time.